welcome to another edition of Eye on Oshkosh. I'm Cheryl Hentz, your host, and very pleased to be joined tonight by two folks who have never been here before. And we're talking about a very, very serious issue tonight. We're talking about that of human trafficking, or some may think of it as sex trafficking. There may or may not be a difference there between the two. We're going to find out tonight. My guests are Pastor Cindy Crane. She is the director of the Lutheran Office for Public Policy of Wisconsin. And then in the orange here, very festive for this time of year, we have Pastor Barb Gerard. And she is a director, she's an advisory council member for the LOPPW, which that's just shorter than saying the whole name all over again. So we're very happy to have you guys here tonight, especially you, Cindy, who you drove up from Madison. So thank you for making that trek, and we're glad that there wasn't snow.
Yeah, so am I. Thanks for having me.
Sure. So first of all, let's find out exactly what human trafficking is, and how does it differ from sex trafficking?
Well, human trafficking is like a modern-day slavery, and it is a situation where someone is coerced into providing labor under force, either with threats or real physical abuse or psychological abuse or legal kinds of things, where they may threaten to take away their passport, or they may threaten that they be arrested or deported. So, and so trafficking can be for labor, and you'll often see some of that with migrant workers. And things like that. So there can be labor issues, but then with sex trafficking, it's the same kind of situation, but then it's coercion to provide a sex act. And so there's the difference. One is for other general kinds of labor, and then there's the sex trafficking.
Okay. So would it be correct then to assume and or say that sex trafficking is a form of human trafficking, but human trafficking does not necessarily equate to sex trafficking?
Correct.
Okay. So there is a very clear distinction in some ways.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Well, statistically speaking, how big of a problem is this really? I know for myself, there for a while, I really didn't hear anything about it. And lately I've been hearing more, seeing more. In recent weeks, I've seen things just on the local news about it. So how big of a problem is this in our state?
In our state or worldwide, first of all, I'll just say it's a $32 billion business.
Wow.
And it is estimated to be second only to drug trafficking. In the United States and in Wisconsin, it really is a hidden crisis. One problem is that it's really hard to get the data. I'm part of the Wisconsin Anti-Human Trafficking Consortium, and at every meeting we have, we talk about the need for data. It's very hard to get because it's so covert. Anyone can be trafficked, but many of the youth are homeless or were homeless, and many of the young people, we focus on anti-sex trafficking, and specifically we have focused on youth, although we support legislation that help adult victims of sex trafficking as well. But many of the victims, youth or adults, are so manipulated, they find it hard to get away from their trafficker or pimp, and we use the word synonymously, by the way. Okay. And it's easier to find a trafficker if somebody comes forward and reports them. It takes an average of 6 times to get away from a trafficker, which is the same number of times it takes on the average for someone to get away from an abusive spouse in a domestic abuse relationship. So that having been said, back in 2007, the Wisconsin Office of Justice Assistance did send out about 1,300 surveys to people who work directly with victims, direct service providers, police officers, etc. and asked them to estimate how many victims there have been of sex trafficking in Wisconsin. They came up with 200 between 2000 and 2007. Now, since that time, there's been a lot of consciousness raising, a lot more awareness. And so a lot of professionals who work directly with these youth or adults are asking the right questions. They have the right tools to ask the right questions. So we have some anecdotal stories. For example, in Madison, Jan Miyazaki, who works with Project Respect with recovering prostitutes, adults, says that she encounters between 50 to 75 women a year who fit the description of somebody who's been sex trafficked. In 2014, in the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, there was an article about sex trafficking, and a youth worker was interviewed. She works with troubled youth, youth who have been abused, and she said over 100 youth she interviewed in 2014 fit the description of sex trafficking. So we have these very powerful anecdotal stories. And of course, Milwaukee, I don't know if you're aware of the article that The Guardian put out called The Harvard of Pimp School, talking about Milwaukee. So, and of course, Milwaukee is close to Oshkosh, and that will impact very much the Fox Valley. So those are some powerful anecdotes. We don't want to be tempted to make up statistics. So I would rather give anecdotal stories that say a lot about the numbers, but we continue to struggle with finding ways to get data.
Sure. So yeah, I think you just sort of answered a question that had just come to mind with me. So prostitution is sex trafficking then?
Well,
or not
always. Not
Okay.
always. There are some professionals who will say, some professionals who work to help prostitutes and people who've been sex trafficked, that prostitution is never a victimless crime. Not everyone agrees with that. I can't say I know for sure, but there is a distinction between the two. Someone can choose on their own to be a prostitute. To be trafficked means that there is manipulation, coercion involved. And with trafficking, it almost always involves beatings and rape. So even though they may not be beaten at the beginning, depends on the type of pimp who gets the young person or the adult in.
Sure.
But there is a difference, and when we talk about legislation, you know, some of the laws make the distinction as well.
What, I mean, how do we in Wisconsin compare to other states, especially our neighboring states, Illinois, not Indiana, they're below there, Minnesota? You know, do you know at all how we compare to our neighboring states?
Well, I was just at a seminar in Green Bay that actually was hosted by the women of the ELCA, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. It was an excellent conference, and Teresa
Flores.
Thank you. Teresa Flores was a speaker there. She's a survivor of sex trafficking, and she's from Ohio. And she said that, and I didn't know this, that Wisconsin is actually number 5 in the top states of, you know, where sex trafficking has been discovered. Now, I was reading an article in which a police officer from, I believe it was Brown County, was interviewed, who said that it could possibly be because we're paying so much attention to it. Minnesota is up there high too, but they also pay a lot of attention to it. But Wisconsin is in the top 5 in the country, and Milwaukee is in the top few hubs for trafficking in the United States, as far as cities are concerned.
So,
may I also say something?
Sure, go ahead.
The reason Wisconsin is number 5 is because of all of the sports activities, because they tend to be hubs for trafficking, the vacationing, and also the highway system. It's easy to transport people with the major highways going through Wisconsin. As a matter of fact, when we decided to make this a priority a few years ago, it was really the bishop in La Crosse, Bishop Jim Ahrens, who said La Crosse is a stopover between Chicago and the Twin Cities, and there have been a lot of problems there. One of his close friends' daughter was kidnapped, and the issue got a lot of attention in La Crosse. And as in every area, when you start to look beneath the surface, you see that there's more than you anticipated.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so that has raised a few other questions for me. So when you say that Wisconsin is number 5, and because we pay so much attention to it and so forth.
Maybe that's the reason it
Yep,
is.
yep,
Yeah.
yep. So when you say something like that, does that mean that because we're focusing on it so much that more people are talking about it and relating their own stories, perhaps, or other people are drawing, because we're talking about it, their attention is being drawn to it? Kind of like, okay, I'll use an example here. Domestic violence.
Oh, yeah.
Years ago, and when I say years, I'm talking decades ago, you didn't hear much about it. It was sort of an unspoken sort of thing.
Right.
What goes
right.
on behind someone's doors in their own home is nobody's business. And then we started having more awareness and things
Right.
like that, and more crimes of domestic violence and abuse started being reported.
Right.
So is that kind of what may be happening here?
Well, I think so, because if between 2000 and 2007, with 1,300 surveys sent out, only 200 people fit the description of having been sex trafficked, and then you have someone interviewed in Milwaukee, and she said in 1 year she interviewed over 100 youth in 1 year. And then other stories from around the state, I would say so. More people have tools to talk about it, and more police are getting involved. There is an effort by the FBI working with police around the state, a project called Cross Country, and they have been able to, through their stings, uncover a lot of trafficking. Just in October, 15 sex traffickers were arrested in Brown County. So would that have happened 10 years ago? I don't know. But again, I don't feel like an expert in how the police operate, but certainly I think what you said could be the truth, could be a reason.
So do you have any statistics on this area right here, the Fox River Valley, Winnebago County?
Well, just the more anecdotal stories. In 2013 in Oshkosh, there were 31 arrests of cases related to prostitution, and in 2014 there were 50 more arrests. Those are the most recent statistics I have.
Okay. All right. Yeah, and I'm trying to think now about the story that I saw on one of the local news channels. I thought that it was someone in Green Bay who was caught for, and charged with trafficking. So how, and I know that this can happen in any number of ways, but how does someone actually fall victim to trafficking?
Well, anybody can be vulnerable to trafficking. But one of the ways that it can happen is we can use the term Romeo, so that's someone who tries to groom a young girl, befriends them, treats them with a lot of respect, and gives them gifts, and pays a lot of attention to them, listens to them, and the girl just feels so special.
Sure.
And so once they're kind of seduced into it, then more and more pressure is put on for her to do sex acts. And so, and then that can be quite typical. So it can be anybody. They'll go into the schools. They might meet them at the malls. They might meet them at McDonald's. They might meet, you know, so they can be anywhere. And what young girl doesn't like attention from an older guy? And, you know, God, this is really special. It can happen with that person can also be a guerrilla, where they just are. That's a term for someone who uses violence right away. They're kidnapped and just taken away. But it also can happen when a young woman might befriend a young woman and just become good friends. Comes from one of the books that I read, where she met a young girl by the swimming pool and just befriended her and became good friends, and then she invited her to a party, and then that's how she was trafficked. So anybody can be trafficked.
And then online too.
Pardon me?
And online.
And online, yep. And I've heard stories of, you know, on Facebook, if someone sees that they've had a fight with a parent, they then befriend them and start talking to them, and who doesn't want to be listened to, and then they ask them to meet up, and so some people are more vulnerable than others. If someone already has a history of abuse, they're going to be more vulnerable. Runaways have a much higher risk of being trafficked. The average time from being out on the street before they're trafficked is 48 hours. And so people are watching for that, so they see the young girls out there, and within a couple of days they can be trafficked. Other people who are really vulnerable would be the LGBTQ community. They are more vulnerable because they're more likely to be kicked out of their homes.
Okay.
And
so there we're talking about younger kids.
Younger kids. Well, and the average age is around 13. It can start even younger than that, and it can start older, but 13 is an average age where a young girl is drawn in. 13.
Yeah, that's very young. And you know, this whole online thing, it's frightening on so many levels, because you know, a lot of parents, I'm not saying all, but a lot of parents don't really have any idea what their kids are doing online.
My son met someone and was talking to someone in Canada. And it was like, you know, when we were growing up, who would have been talking to someone in Canada?
Well, we didn't have all these. We didn't have all these things back then. But you know, I mean, parents just don't know what their kids are doing online, and I think part of that is they don't understand it themselves. You know, I mean, we didn't grow up with computers, and I say we because we're probably all in about the same age range here. When I was going to high school, a computer was a huge IBM unit that would take up probably this whole corner behind me here. You know, no one ever thought of smartphones and laptops and, you know, desktop computers that you can pick up for a couple $100, and nobody envisioned social media becoming what it was.
And kids are so trusting that the person that's on the other side of that screen isn't going to hurt them. You know, they just
because they're on the other side of the screen.
And so they just don't. And so it is, social media really puts more and more kids at risk.
Could I add something too? The traffickers usually don't work alone. That's another aspect to this. You imagine you're 13, 15, whatever, and you have a team of people out to get you. That's how you get manipulated and forced. So that's, I think, an important detail that police often talk about when I hear them give presentations.
Yeah, well, you know, and going back to the parents, the other thing is a lot of parents trust their kids. And I know everybody would like to trust their children, but it's the other people that your kids are associating with who you don't know, and chances are they don't necessarily know some of those people that you can't trust. And, you know, I've talked to parents, some who I know pretty well, and their attitude has just, and I wasn't even thinking in terms of trafficking. I'm just thinking in terms of identity theft or, you know, bullying or whatever the case may be. And they just say, oh, it's fine. I trust little Susie, or I trust little Johnny. You know, it's not a big deal. Nothing. They're so naive.
There's a good resource that brings up just what you're talking about. It's called Chosen, and it's put out by Chosen, and it's put out by Shared Hope International. And one of the stories told there is about a young girl. She's maybe 15, 16, and straight A student, good student, but is approached and is being groomed. And it's her friends and family that start to suspect something and trying to convince her that something's off. And so a lot of times parents may suspect something, but they don't know how to approach it, or they may try and talk to the girl, and the girl says, no, Mom, this is a really, this guy wouldn't do that. So it's a both and. Parents need to be aware and watching for changes in behavior. But there's that either naivete or that same kind of thing that happens in abuse situations where you don't want to admit it's happening. But Chosen really gets at that. It raises up that issue of the relationship that you have to be talking about the issues.
And that's a book or a video?
It's a DVD.
A DVD, okay. Chosen. And who puts that out?
Shared Hope International.
Shared Hope International. Okay.
And I have that information that I can give you here.
Okay. And by the way, we've got a website for the Lutheran Office for Public Policy of Wisconsin, and it is loppw.org. And I know we've got it on the screen, but for our radio listeners, I'll just try to remember to keep repeating this throughout the show.
Thank you.
It's loppw.org, and there's a whole section on that website that people can look and you know, find out more information. You know, I think it's just a good idea for parents, whether it's to prevent their kids from being trafficked or some other reason. It's a good idea for parents to take the time, and it's not that much time that you're committing to, but take the time to learn how to find out what your kids are doing online. And, you know, there's software out there that you can get for very little money or no money, and there are apps that you can put on their smartphones that you can find what they're doing, and you can block certain things. There are ways so that you can take certain precautions so you and your kids are not just sitting ducks. And that would be good for parents and for other adults too, because it's not just for parents.
You know what, Cheryl? I should have looked this up before I came, but I think I'll put the link on our website. Right in our backyard at UW-Eau Claire, there is a professor who helped to coin the word cyberbullying. And he's one of the foremost authorities in the world. And there is a lot of information on how parents can talk to their children about the internet. And as I went to a workshop he led, and as I look back at what I learned there, a lot of the advice would fit for this. Of course, bullying is a different issue, but it can also work to talk to your children about watching out for predators.
Sure.
So that's great advice, but I agree, it's really important the internet is like a different world, and a lot of young people know more than we do. And so
that's why I think some people shy away from it.
Exactly, and I couldn't agree with you more. It's good to sit down with them, and not just once, but regularly, and you know, just have conversations about what they're experiencing.
Yeah, I mean, even adults get snookered through the internet.
Exactly.
I mean, you know, social media is a great thing, whether it's a website, you know, for people to make connections, whether it's, you know, Twitter, Facebook, whatever it may be. Don't meet those people unless you've checked them out and you've you kind of have a good handle of who they are, what they're all about. And then when you do meet them in a public place. I mean, identities can be stolen, and I don't want to scare the audience, you know, but any number of things can happen if you don't do due diligence. You know, social media and the website's a wonderful thing, but it can be a not so wonderful thing either if you're not being careful. So now, you know, you mentioned, Barb, that anyone can become a victim. It sounds like what we've been talking about here has mostly been kids, you know, especially those who have been kicked out of their homes and that kind of thing. Can someone of our age become victim?
Very definitely.
And how would that happen with someone as smart and wise as all of us?
The same way that it happens with the kids is, you know, someone approaches us, becomes friendly. You think, wow, this is a nice person, and you know, it's that seduction is the problem with seduction is it's so seductive. It just and you just don't think it's going to happen to you. And one of the things that happens both with kids and adults is sometimes the drugs are introduced, and so that becomes part of the issue. So it can happen in the same way, even though we are so smart and wise. That seduction is seduction, and we just get
be
drawn
careful.
in. Be careful.
Be careful about who you're picking for friends. Be careful about who you're meeting.
Walking to your car alone. You know, those same things that women for years have had to do. We still, you know, we've got to be aware of those safety issues. Those same kind of issues that women for years have had to do. We have to be diligent.
I even heard of, and I can't remember the particulars, and you ladies can probably help fill in the blanks here, but I had even heard of a teenage girl who, and I'm not talking 13 or 14, I'm talking like 17 or 18, 19 years old. She went to a party with some friends and was trafficked from there. Explain for our audience how that can happen.
Well, you can, there's a couple different things. You can either be kidnapped and taken away, or if the pictures can be taken, you know, they can start necking, petting, you know, whatever, and pictures can be taken, and or if there's drugs are introduced where that, you know, so then they're able to have sex with the young girl and pictures are taken, and then those are used to threaten them.
Okay.
And so they say, look, we've got pictures now. If you don't come back and if you don't provide the sex acts that we want, we're going to distribute these. Or they may say, if you don't do these sex acts, we're going to threaten your family, or we're going to do violence. So you can go to the party, and that can be the connection, and the force happens right there.
So I will just say to the audience that, you know, and I don't think that teens are really my demographic necessarily, but you never know how people stumble upon this show. And so I will say what you said before, Barb, that if parents are out there and they're seeing changes in their kids' behavior and school grades and what have you, that's a telltale sign that something is going on. Could be this, could be drugs, could be any number of things, but something is happening, and they should investigate. And, you know, and if someone who's younger, a teenager or young adult is listening or watching to this show, and you feel that you are being bullied in some way, or someone is threatening you in some way, you know, talk to someone about that. Don't just go along with things because you're frightened, you know. Talk to friends, true friends that you've known for a while and you trust, not friends that you've just met on the internet. Talk to the authorities, talk to someone.
Talk to a teacher, talk to a pastor, talk to or another adult. Kids are sometimes not going to want to go to their parents. But so talk to another trusted adult. And, so that brings up too why school systems need to learn more about this, so that if a girl comes and starts to tell a story, that they're believed, and that they know how to help the child get the right connections. So that's a really important thing too, that or any youth worker learns about the issue.
Okay, so I'm not quite finished writing my question yet, but I'll ask it now since you stopped talking. How are you reaching out as an organization?
Well,
how are you reaching out to school districts?
Oh, to school districts. Well, it's not part of the LOPPW mission to reach out to school districts. So the mission involves reaching out to members of the ELCA, that's the acronym for Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, to help build advocates. And I'm actually a registered lobbyist too, so I work at the Capitol. I have 1 foot in the Capitol, 1 foot around the state. I work with all 6 bishops who have congregations in Wisconsin and lead workshops. However, I do work with a variety of groups. We have a variety of partners in the secular and interfaith world. Since working on this issue of human trafficking, we have been invited to lead a workshop to a group of teachers in southern Wisconsin. A retired bishop wants to take one of our resources and translate it into secular language. I mean, that doesn't take much. We, of course, use God language because we are concerned that people see themselves as valued children of God. And when you've been trafficked, you've been taught that you are worth absolutely nothing. And just think of that, worth absolutely nothing. And I feel so inspired by the people who are so resilient that they come out of it and feel great compassion for everyone, whether they can come out or not. But that is our focus. But this retired bishop is translating into secular language, and a few of the people in his area are going to a school district to ask to use the material in their school district. I don't know if they will or not, but whenever I'm at these Wisconsin anti-human trafficking consortium meetings, another thing we talk about is how do we reach young people? Because this isn't just about addressing the problem after it's a huge, ugly problem, which it is. It's a horrible problem. But how do we talk to younger people about how to treat members of the same sex, the opposite sex, friends, people they're developing a sexual relationship with? How do you have that respect? And of course, working with the Department of Public Instruction, DPI, would take some time. I think there are probably some people working on that. And we thought, well, we're not the school district. We don't have power over that, but we can at least come up with a resource and invite congregations to use it. So this is a resource that talks about trafficking, but it also has a section in it on healthy versus unhealthy versus abusive relationships. So we hope that no child we talk to is ever going to be trafficked, but this would be helpful to them in dealing with other relationships, and there's some recommended videos. One is a video on abusive relationships and dating, which is an under-talked about area. So that's, even though our focus is public policy, we came up with this, and I lead workshops. Barb co-led one workshop with me of people in the northwest area of Wisconsin who are empowered to go out and lead workshops on their own. I believe we'll get to that more later. But the schools, of course, the teachers have so many things to do. It's like, one more thing to tell teachers to do. But of course it is important to talk about how we engage with one another at an early age.
Well, and it doesn't even have to be something that the teachers have to do. I think it should be a school-wide thing.
Yeah.
And, you know, I can remember, it's been a while, but I can remember when I was in high school, we would have general assemblies where things would be discussed. And this could be a general assembly type issue rather than something being taught actually in a classroom. I mean, and that way you're reaching more of a mass than just, you know, certain classrooms doing it.
So, and part of then what individuals can do is, when you ask how do we reach school districts, there's a small group in our area that just started meeting, and we said, well, what can we do? And one of the things that we did was provide the school districts in our area with that video chosen and ask them to view it and to see what they could do with it. And so, and each school district's handling it a little bit different. So if our listeners then would look at the different resources and go to their school districts and say, will you please address this issue?
Right.
Each school district will handle it differently because sex is a hard topic, and even though we're not talking about the sexual act, when we're talking about human trafficking, people will get squeamish.
Yeah, but we're also not just talking about sex, as we said right from the very outset, and that's something that I think that school districts have to be made aware of.
Yeah, and that's a thing. So so individuals can contact their school districts and say, please, we want our kids to learn about this. We want them to learn the danger signs. We want to learn about healthy relationships. Please do what you can.
Sure.
You know what? Thanks for saying that, Barb. The work you've done in your area is phenomenal. But I wanted to mention, I'm so glad you brought up school districts, because another thing people can do is try to get local experts into schools to give talks. Jody Emerson, who works for Fierce Freedom up in the Eau Claire area, she's been traveling around to schools all over the northwestern part of Wisconsin, and she was in a rural school, and after her presentation, a girl came up to her and said, you know, my boyfriend makes me have sex with his friends and takes money for it. Is that kind of what you're talking about? And I really gasped when I heard that. But had she not given that talk, the awareness wouldn't have been raised enough for her to ask that question. And, you know, it also helps adults to be in touch when we hear stories like that there are things happening right in schools. So they're wonderful. You know, we'll talk about resources later, but it's good to encourage your school district to encourage local experts to give presentations in schools, because you never know what someone's going through.
Well, that's true, and I just, schools, churches, which obviously is one of the things that you guys are doing, but school districts for sure is a place that I think really needs to work on this. I mean,
do think
it's
so, yeah.
part of education. It may not be the core subjects, but it's one of those life subjects.
Yeah, at an assembly. Yeah.
So when someone, and I want to touch on, you know, what the police are doing, but if someone becomes a victim of trafficking, how do you break out of that? And I guess it probably depends on what your age is, because someone our age may find it easier to break out of the situation than someone who's 13 or 12 or whatever the case may be. And it probably also depends, I'm thinking, on the type of trafficking that's involved and how serious it is, how long it's been going on, and that kind of thing. But as a general rule, how does someone break out of that situation?
Well, if they can, there are some toll-free numbers they can call so that they can be hooked up with local resources. And then they start getting individual support to do that. And some of that depends on county by county, region by region, what services are available. What they're finding is that the girls who have been trafficked, or young boys, often can't continue to live at home and continue to go to school because of, I mean, it's pretty traumatic and stigmatizing. So they're finding they need to go to a group home that is designed just for kids who have been trafficked, because there's so much of a life change that has to happen. And that's part of what the work is being done, is to provide more and more of those services to the girls.
There are very few.
There
right
are very
now.
few.
That's a problem. Not having services is a huge problem in the state. So that's one of the issues we've addressed on a public policy level. Because to get out, well, for one thing, it's really hard to get out, as we've talked about earlier. It's out of fear. It's difficult to break away. And then sometimes it's scarier to be in this different world, a healthier world, than to be with your pimp, because even though you're treated so terribly by the pimp, there's this sense of belonging there, and maybe some semblance of love and family. They're called family by the traffickers, the pimps, but the pimps talk to one another about them as their stables. So that's who they really are to them. But to try to break out into a new setting can be very frightening, and so they sometimes will go back and
Right,
and
5
then
to
some
6
are
times is the average.
is the average so providing services is also expensive because of the way they've been treated. They have post-traumatic stress syndrome, and they have a lot of problems, and some of them, that's not really even the right term for them, because if they were abused before they were trafficked, they've had a life of trauma. Which, you know, post-traumatic stress syndrome, it implies that at one time you were okay, and then you had this trauma. But if you've had a series of experiences of being abused, then so you need a lot of services, and sometimes they have been made to be addicted to drugs. So that's another service that they would need. And I would like to be more positive about the services available, but there's some good news we can talk about later. I know you want to ask about legislation and that kind of thing, but that's I'd say, from everything I've heard. I'm not a direct service provider, but from everything I've heard from every service provider I've talked to, not having enough money for services is key to dealing with this.
As it is with everything. Fighting drugs, fighting mental illness. So if someone has been kidnapped and they just all of a sudden disappear, how can they break out of that situation?
Well, there's the story of the person in La Crosse I mentioned earlier. His daughter was kidnapped, and all of a sudden she started turning up on porn sites on the internet. And I don't recall if it was the family who found it or the police. The police might have been the ones to find it, and they were able to track her down. So that was one way. They're so threatened, though. Many times they threaten to kill the young person's family. There's so many horrible incentives to keep them there. There is this, if you want to hold up that poster, there is this toll-free number that
Can we zoom
truckers...
in on that?
Yeah, please do, and please ask people to write this number down. This is a national number, 1-888-373-7888. And a wonderful group that's been doing a lot to report trafficking is a group called Truckers Against Trafficking. And a lot of them just carry a card inside their wallet. And, you know, they'll be at a truck stop, and if they see some young girls come up to the truck and ask them if they want sex, and they look like they're pretty young, they'll call that number. And there's the Truckers Against Trafficking has a lot of great videos on their website, and in one of them, there's an interview with a girl who was saved by a trucker.
Okay, very good.
Somebody called the number, and now she is married and has children, has a relationship back with her mother, but other ways they can be rescued would be through police stings. Things like that.
Okay.
So,
Motel and hotel people, people,
yes,
they
thank
need
you.
to become more aware of
Right.
the issue. So if they see young women coming in that don't seem quite the right age, or somehow
Right,
something
right,
seems
yeah.
off, they need to be able to start calling law enforcement if they see something is off.
Okay, so those are more like sex trafficking things. What if an adult is trafficked into doing some kind of hard labor for someone and things like that? I mean, how do you break out of that?
yeah, I have to be honest and say I haven't studied that as
Okay.
much. I know I've read in our resource, we have a little bit about that.
I
We
think
haven't
what-
had any legislation. We have to do work through LOPPW that has some kind of legislative connection.
Okay.
And certainly immigration is one of our new priorities, so we might get into it via that way
Okay.
too.
And that's going to be harder because many of those who are trafficked for labor are migrant, and so the fear of being deported is real, and so to try and reach out to law enforcement, so that has many other layers of
Sure.
how are they going to get out
Sure.
of it.
Well, we've mentioned law enforcement a couple of different times. How does law enforcement go about tracking down, like if it's a group that's trying to do this? What is law enforcement doing to solve this problem?
Well, the FBI has really joined forces with a lot of police in local areas, and including throughout Wisconsin, to create stings, to uncover these traffickers. Sometimes it might involve. And it would be great to ask a police officer this question, because I'm not police either, but they might try to fool somebody on the internet via back pages, which is a horrible website where people go to buy sex. So some people have been found out that way. I know in Dane County that one thing the police do is once a year they make, I think it might be, throughout Dane County, at least in Madison, they make a concerted effort to go out to places where they know there is prostitution. Although with youth I never use that word, I use forced to sell sex. So they'll go out to those areas and go up to people and say, look, I'm not interested in arresting you. I'm wondering, do you need anything? And then they try to develop a relationship or a new relationship with someone they haven't seen before. And by doing that, they have helped some people get services. They have even helped some youth get services. And when they're able, that in and of itself is beautiful. But when they do that, they also have a better chance of catching the traffickers. Because one of the best ways to catch the traffickers is for somebody to say, look, this is my trafficker. This is where you can find him or her.
Yep.
Or them. It's usually them.
Okay.
And that is the best way to get at them. And I know in Wisconsin, I can't speak for all the police, but I think with awareness that has been raised, there is more and more of an effort to get at the traffickers and look at the victims more as victims.
Sure. What kind of legislation do we currently have on the books? And you guys work with legislation and lobbying and so forth.
Right.
What's on the books right now to
Well,
help?
there was some good legislation passed a couple of years ago in 2014 that changed the meaning of the word consent, so that somebody says, well, the person who bought sex I heard a sister say she doesn't like using the word John because a lot of good men are named John. So I'm trying to stop using it. It's a little hard though. But so the person about sex said, well, you know, she gave her consent and they catch the trafficker, and the trafficker said, well, she gave her consent. She never said no. And well, what is the meaning of the word consent? If you're made to be addicted to drugs, if you've been beaten, if you've been threatened. So now with that aspect of the law changed, it's easier for somebody who has been trafficked to prove that they've been trafficked and then to get their record expunged. So that's you know, I think they're thinking a lot about adults. And then a part of that law also was to make it a stronger felony for the trafficker. So you can see, making the victim look like a victim, and the trafficker look like the one who really needs to have the law come down on him or her. So that's one positive one. And then we supported that. And then there was another one that was passed last year that will make it easier for the police to investigate non-caregivers. In the past, they weren't required to investigate non-caregivers whom they suspected. But now they're mandated to investigate non-caregivers who have a connection with a child. And sex trafficking was put into the list of abuses of children. And then also the poster law was passed where is the poster? Yeah, the poster has been around for a long time. It's from a nonprofit, Polaris. And actually, if you call this number, they're supposed to be excellent at helping somebody to get to the scene of the crime. But now the Wisconsin Department of Justice was mandated to make this available online. They don't hand out copies, so it's a little expensive to print out colored ones if you want a lot of them, but you can go to their site and download that poster. We supported a safe harbor law that would decriminalize children under 18 automatically if they're caught in a sex crime like prostitution. That did not pass, and that one is controversial among people of many leanings because there are so few services that if you if you catch someone 15 in prostitution, what do you do with that young person? And if they're not mandated to go receive services, and if there aren't a lot of services to offer them, well, maybe we should arrest them and keep them in jail, get a social worker to them, etc. But we do think we need to move in the direction of decriminalizing this, and we're hoping that with more services, and some extra money was budgeted for services in the last budget, that with these extra services, eventually safe harbor will be a sunset to that, and we will not need to ever criminalize someone under 18 who is not committing any violent crimes but is simply caught in prostitution.
Okay, so for people listening on the radio, this is this poster that we've been talking about. It's called Stop Human Trafficking. We showed it for the viewing audience earlier. Help stop the buying and selling of women, children, men for sex or labor. It happens here in Wisconsin. You can call toll-free 1-888-373-7888. Again, that's 888-373-7888. Or if you're using a smartphone in a text mode, you can text HELP or info to 233-733. You can also visit the website of BeFreeWisconsin.com. Again, BeFreeWisconsin.com. And the website for our guests is loppw.org. I think we're down to like about a minute and a half or 2 minutes left, probably about 2 minutes. So, I think one of the things that's sort of twirling through my mind here is that with everything we talked about, it's really hard to know who to trust. I mean, it really is. Even at my age, I mean, I'm still making new friends, you know, whether it be through a church organization or I do a lot of volunteer work for other organizations, and so I'm making friends that way. But, you know, when you're younger, kids in particular like to make friends. You know, they think because you're a Facebook friend, you're a friend.
Yeah.
And there's a huge difference. And so it's very, very hard for kids to know who to trust. And do you have any brief thoughts on what they can do or what a parent can do to help kids know who to trust and who not to?
Well, I would say encourage group discussions in community centers, churches, schools, to get people thinking as a group about this.
Okay.
That was one suggestion I have. And to, in one of the videos recommended in here, it talks about how important it is for a youth to have an adult they can trust, often outside their family. And, you know, alert more adults to, if young people seem to write you off, they might need you sometime. And if you may not realize how much you're doing to nurture trust, but that's important to do.
Okay. All right.
And I would say, you know, a piece of that is if it feels,
Yes.
if something feels off, trust that.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Trust it.
Although kids don't necessarily know what's off and what's
but
not off.
I,
But
you know,
some do.
I think some go, something doesn't quite. So to trust that too. To
Trust your gut.
Trust your gut.
instinct.
And,
instinct.
Oh, I have one last.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, very good. Well, thanks for being here. We're out of time. I'm sorry. Did you have something really quick?
Really quick, ask your legislators to support all the money budgeted for the Department of Children and Families for trafficking, for trafficked youth.
Okay.
Not for
All right.
trafficking, for trafficked
And
youth.
we're out of time.
Okay.
I got to stop there. I got to cut you off. I'm sorry. Thanks to both of you.
Okay,
for being
thank
here.
you.
I appreciate it very much.
Yeah.
And thanks to the crew. And
Yeah,
as
thank
always,
you.
thanks to you for tuning in or listening, whichever way you're getting this information. We'll see you next time. Until then, take care. Keep your eye on us. We've got our eye on Oshkosh.